Hey everyone, I'm Sukan and I'm here with Brian. We're the managing partners at Iterative. Today we're going to talk about why you should or should not start a startup. Brian, maybe let's start this question with looking back on why we started a startup. I think is like a good place to kind of start. We were actually obviously together when this kind of happened, but maybe kind of like why did you actually started the startup and then kind of pulled me into it? Why did you initially start a startup?
I don't know if I'm strange. I might be strange, but I think I decided
I
very
think you
early
are
on in
strange, by the
college
way.
that I wanted to build. Yeah, okay. I wanted
Yeah.
to build companies, and so maybe I'll just go faster because I don't know if I'm like other people. College, wanted to build companies. Decided that that was the most impactful thing I could do for the world. Maybe in particular, I just thought building a business and getting people aligned on the same goal was kind of again, just like the most impactful thing someone could do. And so I walked into it thinking I would do a startup someday. So I think I was pretty set from kind of like the get go.
Okay, so impact was your thing. You really cared about impact.
Impact was
Okay,
100% like my
got it.
thing. How about you? I'm curious because I don't
Yeah, I
know
don't
what
think we've
the
actually
answer
ever
is.
talked about this, even though we've been working together for so long. This is going to be somewhat counterintuitive. I didn't really care about impact. Like, wasn't that big of a deal to me. I think for
Such a bad
well,
person.
maybe. I feel like, and you know this about me, I just really like building stuff, and I want to make like stuff that is like good. And you give me a hard time about this. Is like I care a lot about just like making stuff that's good, and so I feel like making products is kind of like a craft thing to me where I'm like, oh, I just want to be really good at making stuff. And it seems like startups
Mm.
was like a way that I could like make stuff full time and make whatever I wanted. And so that's why it kind of appealed to me. I think startups was not something I had in my head. It was just like a thing that people kind of like said you could do and build stuff kind of like full time. And so for me, I was just like, okay, well, I just want to build stuff full time. So if you call that a startup, that's I guess what I'm gonna do. But that was really kind of like it.
You're like a Jiro, the sushi, the Netflix like sushi
I mean,
chef.
there's definitely parts of that that speak to me. I'm no way on his kind of like realm or anything like that. But like, yeah, there is parts of that where it's like I just like making kind of like stuff, and so I think that was the biggest thing to me. Actually, we're like starting to hit on this list. Maybe let's go into this first section on why you should start a startup, and we'll pick from this idea list here. So, context for everybody. Brian and I put together kind of like a short list of kind of ideas. And then, Brian, let's go back and forth and we'll kind of like pick one and we can talk about it a little bit and then we'll kind of move on to the next one. Why don't you pick from the list first?
Sure. Okay. So the question is, why should you
Yep.
start a startup? I think the primary reason why you should start a startup is because there's a really big problem that just like irks you. If you don't do it, someone else is going to do it. Or sorry, if you don't do it, you think nobody else is going to do it. Like you feel like you're the only one out there who kind of like either recognizes the problem or has the like chops to go fix it. And so typically, and when we invest in founders, we're kind of like looking for that. And I feel like when we started companies, we try to make that one of the reasons why we're starting a
But
startup.
that's kind of tough, right? Because it's like, I mean, for most problems and most people, it's like they're not the only person that can kind of like solve this. There's like a rare breed of people that kind of like solve that. Like, I've actually never liked that reason. And part of the reason why I don't like that reason is I just think it's unrealistic. Like, I think there's just a lot of problems that many people can solve. And it's like, I'm not the only person that can see it. I'm not the only person that can kind of like solve it. And so I guess there's two parts to it. There's one that is like, you just can't stand this problem and you're like, I'm going to do something about it. Like, there are other people that can do something about it, but they're not doing anything, so like screw it, I'm going to do it. There's like that piece, and then there's like the what other piece that is like, I'm the only person in the world that can do this thing and I need to save the world, so I'm going to like do that. So I think there's like two parts to that.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe. I mean, it's not. You're right. You're right. Like the latter. It's not the
Yeah,
latter. It's the former. Right. It's like there's a problem. It doesn't matter if anyone else is doing it. You're like, I have to solve this problem. Right. Is kind of like what I think is a good reason.
I think one of the things that we talk about with companies in the batch too is that oftentimes really, really good startups and kind of really good founders, it almost, the way they talk about what they're doing, it almost sounds that they're like on a crusade. Like they're like righting some wrong in the world and they like can't kind of like do anything else until they like right that wrong. So I think that's kind of like what you're talking about a little bit. Um, which I think in large part is actually why we started Iterative. We were just like, hey, in Southeast Asia, these founders aren't getting kind of the support we're looking for. And like, I remember you asking me about it, and I just was like, I just would get super pissed and just be like, can you believe this is happening? I can't believe this doesn't happen or whatever. And I think so. Iterative was probably that for me. But it sounds like a crusade.
Yeah.
I think a lot of
Yeah,
times.
we're all saying this, but like the anger or the frustration kind of like feeling that you have, right, is a
Yeah.
good sign you're onto not you're onto something, but you're onto something that you feel like you want to
Yep.
that can last. Because typically like you get lost in the startup journey very often, and you can come back to this kind of like initial impulse or feeling.
That's actually a really interesting thing to kind of frame this conversation too, because like part of what you're looking for is like startups are really hard, and we'll talk about why startups are hard and all that kind of stuff. But you're almost looking for like you need enough reason or compulsion to like go through all the hard stuff, and so that needs to come from somewhere, and it needs to be like sufficient. And so I think that's like a good way to kind of frame this on some level. Maybe let me go to one of mine from the list that I think resonates with you and I quite a lot. You and I are quite big into kind of like personal growth and development and all that stuff. And I often think that startups are a really good, they're to me probably the best way to kind of like develop professionally and kind of like learn things and all of that stuff. And so I think in large part, I don't know if you agree with this. I've always thought this about us, that part of the reason why we wanted to do a startup is because it was such a good opportunity to kind of like learn and grow, especially when we started and we were like 22 or something like that. We were like, if we do a startup, it'll like fast forward our careers by like 10 years and we'll learn a bunch of stuff and whatever. Does this resonate with you?
I don't know if I agree with fast forward your career because I feel like you chose a
Yeah.
different path than a lot of other people are going to take, and I don't know if it's like that likely that you'll like get back
It's
into
a
like a big
different
company or
career
industry or
path.
whatever. But I yeah,
Yeah.
a different career path. But I do think I think what resonates is it is one of the like
Mm.
steepest
Mhm.
learning curves. And there's certain types of people that really, really enjoy steep learning curves, just because you like learn so much. And this I think this happens in a lot of kind of like complex I don't know, math, right? Like if you want to go really deep into math and there's like a steep learning curve there, or like, I don't know, there's, you can name a number of things, but building startups ends up being one of the steepest learning curves of anything I think you can do with your life. And certain types of people gravitate towards that.
Um, Short aside, why do you think it's so steep? I mean, I obviously 100% agree with you, but like, why do you think it's so steep comparative to like other things that you could do?
I think maybe it's because you just have to learn so many things in a very short amount of time, right? Like you have to learn how to do product, do engineering, do marketing, work with, and things change all the time, right? Like new technologies come, and then you need to understand business and marketing, and you weren't trained on any of this stuff. That's kind of like one part. Work with people, be a good like founding CEO, like all this kind of stuff. And it would be fine if you had time, but you don't have time. Like every single day you're dying, and so you're like, what do I need to learn and get better at
I
today?
sometimes with the way you're talking about it makes me think about like it's almost like you get dropped in this like jungle, and the jungle is like really efficient, and in order like when you do a startup, you get dropped in this jungle, you kind of don't know how anything works. You're like your startup is close to death at any moment. You have to like there's a lot of pressure to kind of like figure it out, and I think that pressure just makes you have to be very kind of efficient and learn a lot. And so I feel like it's that kind of curve. I feel like maybe other things, it's like they're just more friendly environments. Like there's more guardrails. People tell you what to do. Whereas startups is just like, hey, there's this really competitive jungle, and it's like really tough. We're just going to drop you in that. Hope you figure it out. And if you can kind of like take that, I think then you kind of learn a lot. Okay, one more reason from you, and then I'll get one more reason.
Sure. I like the
Mm.
autonomy one, right? Because I think a lot of people are like, oh, I don't want a boss. I want to build my own kind of like business, etc. So I'm just kind of like someone who isn't good at taking orders. Uh, I think it's a good one, but at the same time, I think a lot of people when they first jump in don't realize how much responsibility there is. And so I think it's kind of like a double-edged sword a little bit, right? It's kind of like I'd love to do things by myself, be my own boss, and then all of a sudden you're like working 24/7, right? You're uh, trying to figure out what decisions are right. Yeah, working responsibilities, all that kind
I
of
feel
stuff.
like
So
that was definitely like us. We
that's
were
good.
like, "Oh yeah, I want to be able to kind of like make decisions and have a lot of autonomy and stuff." And I feel like you and I, kind of 15 years in, are like, "Oh my gosh, like, can other people tell us what to do?" I think there's a lot that comes with it. You don't just like get autonomy, and there's no kind of like cost to that, right? So, but I think there is a certain type of person. And I think at the end of the day, you and I are like this, where it's like we're willing to pay the cost for that level of autonomy, and so I think it's like okay for us. Okay.
Yeah. I sorry, my last thing on this one, just because I think it's funny, because everyone's like, "Oh, I would love to not have a 9 to 5 job," and then you end up doing the startup thing, and then you don't realize it's a 9 to 9 job. It's like you're on all the time
Are
because you
are
just
you
can't
like
turn
this
it
with
off.
me? Sometimes I look at people with 9 to 5 jobs. I'm like, it just sounds nice. Like
It would be
be
so
able to
great.
turn. And I
Yeah.
think it's the weird part of this is, and look, 9 to 5 people work hard too. I'm not trying to kind of throw shade at people working 9 to 5, but I think in startups it's really hard to turn it off. So even if I'm like not sitting at my computer working, you're still kind of thinking about stuff, and so it's just hard to turn off. And sometimes I think about jobs where it's like very clear cutoffs. Like if you work at a coffee shop and the coffee shop closes at 5, like the coffee shop is closed, you're kind of like you go home and you do something else and you don't think about it, right? And I think that kind of like delineation is like I think important. Okay, let me hit my last one because I'm actually curious what you think about this. I'm now realizing also that we've been doing stars for a long time. We've been co-founders like 3 times. We have never had any of these conversations about why we do the things we're doing. We're just like doing them. um, Okay, one of the things that I think is kind of like a good reason to start a startup, and again, I'm curious if you think this way. Startups always just sounded like a lot of fun to me. Like it just sounded like an adventure, and it was fun, and I knew it sounded like stressful and uncertainty and all of that kind of stuff. But it just seemed like a grand adventure, and that always appealed to me. Um, does that appeal to you? Does that make sense to you? Is that like a bad reason to start a startup?
I think it's great reason to start a startup. And I really don't want to dissuade people, but I feel like it's the
Mm,
catalyst, right? It's kind of like, oh, it's gonna be a grand adventure, and then like you step in, and then now you're like, crap, I'm in this gigantic forest of
yeah.
nothingness. What do I do? And so it very quickly goes away, but it's like one of the best catalysts.
And maybe just the like nuance here. I think it's like it's definitely a good catalyst. And I think that if you are starting a startup for this reason, I think the thing that you need to be able to find and figure out, which is I think what we've kind of been able to figure out, is that like can you have fun during even kind of like the tough times, right? And so bad stuff will kind of happen and you're still kind of like having fun because it's like part of this adventure. um you and I kind of talk about like sometimes being a founder is like you kind of have like a pirate ship and you're like trying to like find treasure somewhere and go somewhere, and being a pirate is like actually probably horrible 99% of the time. It's like you're running out of food and you get attacked by other pirates and all that kind of stuff. But there's like a part of that that just is like interesting and kind of like fun to kind of figure out. And so I think if it starting a start because it sounds fun is reasonable. The real trick to longevity is, can you actually continue to have fun despite how kind of like bad things are going to get within the startup? Just and because I think for a lot of people, startups are not fun most of the time. I don't think you would characterize that. Like if you just took a poll of Brian and I in any kind of like moment in kind of a day, I don't know if we'd be like, oh my gosh, we're having so much fun. It's a lot of work and kind of stressful, which we'll kind of get into. But I think at the end of the day, both of us kind of think about our what we've done the last 15 years is like we've had quite a lot of fun. I think about it. Do you characterize it that way?
No, 100%.
Okay, so just to recap this section, Brian, you had like a mix of like purpose and kind of impact. I think for why you should start a startup. I went personal growth. You went autonomy, and then I kind of went like sounds like fun. Basically, you think you're gonna have fun doing this. Let's switch gears. Let's go to the other side of this. This list is long. Let's talk about why people should not start a startup. Um, and we can have the debate about kind of whether it's for everybody or not, but a bunch of reasons for why it's not why you should not start a startup. Um, Brian, maybe you go first. We'll do the same kind of thing here. Maybe Brian, you pick. What is your top reason for why you should not start a startup?
For me, it's the like you're not willing
Yeah,
to sacrifice on your most of the
I
time it's
knew this was going to be
lifestyle.
your pick. By the way,
And
100% knew this was going to be your pick. Go ahead.
yeah, and I feel like a lot of people know this, right? But like when you're a startup founder, you have to actively avoid. You're like not going to people's birthday dinners. You don't go out anymore. You like for those that are single, like good luck, right?
I
On your like
feel
kind of like
bad
dating
for it.
journey. Yeah. So I mean, I have a lot of kind of like respect for people who are
Yeah.
able to like balance their lives with kids and with all this kind of stuff. But it's just tough. Like you're making active decisions uh to kind of like maybe cut off is the too strong of a word, but like you're losing
Yeah.
friendships and relationships because of how much you're kind of like working all the time.
I mean, I can tell kind of like a good example of this, Brian, like over the weekend, right? So, context for everybody was we had demo day yesterday. So for our winter 2023 batch, we literally had day yesterday, and we were working kind of all through the weekend to kind of like get companies ready and get demo day prepped and all that stuff. I happened to be going to see my parents in Penang, which is where I'm from, with my girlfriend's parents, and they were meeting for the first time. So both parents are meeting for the first time in Penang, and I probably spent half the time in the hotel room, right? And the other half that was not in the hotel room was because I was like going to dinners and like lunch. But like the rest of the time, I was basically in the hotel room and taking calls. And I had to have conversations with both sets of parents and my girlfriend and be like, this is something that I've got to do. Demo day is coming up. Like I have these responsibilities. Like, sorry, right? And it was like a 3-day weekend and all of that stuff. And I think the interesting thing is everybody was totally fine with it because they were just like, this is how it is for Sukan, right? This is like the choices Sukan has made, and this is like what he's got to do in order to kind of like do that. And so this is the type of stuff that you have to kind of like do and kind of make. And it doesn't just affect you, it kind of affects people around you, and you have to have all these extra conversations and all that kind of stuff, right? Would I have loved to spend the entire 3-day weekend just like hanging out in Penang and like eating food and all that stuff? Totally, right? But like I made a decision to do this thing, and you have responsibilities, and you have to kind of like sacrifice for it. And so this was like a very real thing to me, just like over the weekend. So this one, and I guess the way you're framing it is, if you are not willing to kind of make those sacrifices and commitments, you're like, you should think hard about whether like starting a startup is right for you. Hey, do you have a litmus
Yeah,
test for this? How do you
I
people
think
know?
so.
I feel like most people would think that they are willing to do this, and then like you're like year 7 in on like no weekends, and you're like, oh man, I don't know.
What is a what is a good test?
I don't know if you and I knew
Yeah,
how much sacrifice it
I'm
was going
not
to take
sure.
when we started.
I don't think it was hard for me because I'm just like super nerdy and I don't care about
Well,
other people, all right?
sure.
And so I was just like, okay, this is like
Yeah.
what life's gonna be. Uh, but we were also super
Yours would be.
young, right? And so kind of like as you get older, it just makes it
Yeah.
harder. It doesn't make you any worse. It just makes it harder because you have
I
more
actually think you and I
responsibilities.
almost got lucky in the sense that like it was easier for us because, okay, easy for you because you don't actually have friends and care about people. I think it was easier for me because we started when we were young, and so now like we're starting 22. I'm like 40 now, and so all of my adult life has basically been this, and so it wasn't like I shifted, right? It wasn't like, oh, I had this life that I wasn't making sacrifices. This has kind of just been my adult life, and so I think that's actually been easier for me than like, I don't know. I had a very different life when I switched. Okay, I'm going to pick the really obvious one from this list, Brian. The high risk of failure is just, it's there. It's persistent. Like the majority of startups just like don't work out. And so I think risk tolerance is probably something that people should kind of like think about here. And risk tolerance can mean a lot of different things to different people, but I'm going to just like tell people right now, like a startup going well, whether it's like, I don't know, it gets bought or continues to run past even like year 3 or 5 or something like that, is exceedingly low. Brian, what do you think the percentage is? What do you think the percentage of companies that make it past year 5? Single digit percentage?
Yeah,
Less
less than
than
1%.
1%. Um, and so I think you almost have to go into this whole thing being like, this is probably not going to work out. And like, I feel like that's almost like, God, I don't, is that even like a healthy way to think about it? I think it just like, for me, I just was like, I mean, when we started our first startup, I was like, this is going to fail in 6 months. And then like, that's fine. We'll like figure it out. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think the healthy way to think about it is this will probably not work out and it's going to be okay
Mm,
because, right? Like it's going to be okay because I'll have learned a lot, or it's
one of
going to
the
be okay
reasons. Yeah.
because this
Yeah.
problem was really worth it. It's going to be okay because like X, right? So you have to have this like reason for. Most time it's not going to work out,
I,
but I'm
I
okay
think
with
what's
it.
really interesting about all the reasons you just cited are they're not tied to the outcome, right? And so that makes it kind of like okay. It's like all of the reasons why maybe you should kind of like start or startup are actually not tied to the outcomes for the most part. And so even if the startup doesn't make it or is successful in whatever way you want to define it, you still kind of get what you're looking for out of it because it's just not tied to that. And so I think that's actually kind of like an important piece. So maybe that's the thing that come out of this. It's like two things. One, some people have higher risk tolerance than kind of other people. I think you and I were just like never worried about kind of like failing very much. And so that was like one thing. And then I think the second piece is even if you have low risk tolerance or you would categorize yourself as low risk tolerance, if the reasons you're doing it are not tied to the outcome, then you're kind of in reasonable shape, right? So you know, maybe if you kind of have one or both of these things, then I think you're in good shape. I think you should probably not start a startup if it doesn't sound like fun to you. And I guess what I mean by that is if you haven't started a startup before and you're like thinking about starting a startup, it is at like its max level of fun because you just don't realize how hard it's going to be and all of that kind of stuff. So if at this stage it doesn't sound like fun to you, I just don't know why you would do it. Um, like I think this is like an important part. So you just have to be able to enjoy kind of like the whole journey of a startup. And if it doesn't sound like fun and you have kind of like no urge to do that, I wouldn't start a startup if that's the case. What do you think about this?
I don't know if this is lame, but I just go back to my like the
Yeah.
number one kind of like top reason to start a startup for me is you just really want to solve a problem, right? So for me, I don't know, maybe it's because I'm an
Hmm.
engineer. It's like that's the like engineers are kind of
Hmm.
like problem solvers, and so to me those things are
Yeah.
like tied. Right, it's like it's fun when it's like a really hard
Yeah.
problem and I'm trying to like figure out how to solve it, right? And then it's not fun when it's kind of like not.
I think one
So
thing that maybe people are getting from this, which I think is interesting, is that Brian and I probably do startups for very different reasons. Like Brian is kind of like impact. I want to be able to like solve these big problems, that kind of stuff. And I think I'm like not actually that way. Like to me, I'm just like sounds fun. Like maybe I'm just like more indulgent, and I'm just like I want to have some fun. And like this sounds fun, and I think it kind of ends up in similar places because it ends up being the case that if you work on hard problems, they're just more fun. Like I mean, when I studied math in school, it was like easy problems are not fun, and so it was like you just end up working on harder problems because they're just more interesting. There's more texture. There's like more to kind of work out there, and so I wonder if that's just like where we're kind of like coming out, Brian, is like you're more impact driven. I'm more kind of like I want to have fun and these things just seem like fun. And I think that's a good point to kind of bring to people
yeah,
is that people get into startups for like a lot of different reasons. And so you just have to kind of figure out what yours is. There's not like one single kind of like piece here. Okay. Maybe let's go to the next section here. So we've covered why people should start a startup, why people should not start a startup. Let's have a little bit of fun here. I think this session is kind of the most hilarious. What are bad reasons people start startups? And so you and I have now talked to like I don't know, thousands of founders. You think? I always ask them on some level, like why are they doing the thing they're doing? Why they're getting the startup? And for context for people, the reason why I asked them and Brian is shaking his head, and I think the reason why he asked them is we want to figure out whether the founder is going to be able to like tough it out through the difficult times, and that tends to come through in their motivations. And so we ask people why they start a startup, and we try to get a sense for kind of like what those reasons are, and then we kind of extrapolate why if they're going to be able to kind of stick it out. We've heard lots of bad reasons why people start startups. Brian, maybe I'll go first on here. Um,
yeah,
to me, number one bad reason is to get rich quick. Um, Startups are a horrible way to get rich quickly for a couple of reasons. The chances of the startup kind of doing well is less than 1%. So if you just look at the expected value of starting a startup, it's just like horrible. The magnitude is really high. If it works out, yes, you'll like make lots of money and all that kind of stuff, but the percentage is like so low. And so and it's not quick either. I don't know if people think about startups as like, oh yeah, like somebody started an app and like a year later they were like worth $100 million or something. That's like never the case. I like can't think of a case where that's happened. If I was going to reframe this reason, what an actual startup is like, it's like get rich, probably not over a long period of time, which just sounds kind of like a bad proposition. But yeah, Brian, anything you want to add here?
Most of the success cases were built over
Yeah,
decade plus, right? Like typically what happens is like a founder will
yeah.
start a company. If they're very lucky, they'll return
If
money
you're
to their
lucky, yeah.
investors and then they'll be like, oh, I learned it, whatever, right? And then they'll be like, oh, do I want to do another startup again? And then a second company comes and probably similar thing. Maybe they're like a slightly more successful, maybe they're not. And then like year three, and in like a 10-year journey, you've learned a ton, right? And you just like continue to keep going, and then all of a sudden you hit on something, and then that becomes like $100 million company. And so, like, even on the success cases, what you're seeing kind of like a build up, right, of someone's kind of like startup career over a very, very long time. And maybe the company they started was successful in 9 months because of this kind of like accumulation of experience.
I think what you're saying is that like founders take time to kind of like gestate where they're like developing and all that. So even if a company kind of like catches fire, it's that founder's probably been like working for like a long time, right? Actually,
Yeah, not always the case, but like more often than not,
I feel like
that's
that
probably
was
what's
the
happening.
case. I mean, we can debate kind of like how Clubhouse is doing now, but like I feel like the founder of Clubhouse, he had been basically like working on startups and thinking about growth and product for like a decade. I mean, since we started, I feel like I'd heard about that guy, and he was just like grinding away, working on stuff for a long time. And Clubhouse feels like it caught fire, but like that guy has been like he's been working on tons of different products and all of that stuff for a long time. Brian, you want to pick one from the list?
It's the like to
Yeah,
be famous, right? To like social status and uh, all that kind of stuff. It's just I don't know. I feel like I have a very strong opinion on this, which is there are certain founders that are very good at
yeah,
marketing themselves. And it's helpful, but really
not that
not that
helpful.
helpful for building
It's
a
not.
company, right? And so yeah, I mean, if you're, I think another way to think about it, if you really want to get famous, do it some other way, right? And then use that fame to help your startup rather than like use the startup to.
I feel like if you're going to like tech conferences or something and you're seeing people talk on stage and you're like, oh, I want to be somebody who talks on stage, you should probably not start a startup. Like that's like most people who are starting startups and really working on startup are not speaking at these conferences. They don't go, they don't do any of that stuff. And so I think if you're like looking for that, okay, maybe I'll pick one here. I think this has happened. This happened. I feel like not in the last year, but the year before that. A bad reason I think people start startups is they think it's like the cool thing to do. Like they hear like a bunch of other people doing it, and it seems really cool. And I don't know, they have some friend who raised like 2 million off of nothing, like all this stuff. I think being a startup founder goes through kind of hype cycles, and I think that's just like a bad reason to kind of like do it. There's like a bandwagon kind of like jumping that happens. um Again, I think now that the market is like kind of cooled off, I don't think this is like as much of a thing, but I feel like I saw it quite a lot at the like height of things. People were just like just kind of starting companies because it was like cool, which is so weird because I feel like when we started there was like it was like a weird thing to do. But if I think if you're starting if people are starting companies because of this hype thing, I think it's a bad call. All right, Brian, you want to pick one more, or you want to add on this?
Yeah. I was just gonna go. No, one more
Yeah.
kind of adjacent, which is you think the thing you're working on is
Mm,
very cool. So I think this is a little bit
yeah.
subtle, so maybe I'll explain it a little bit. Oftentimes people are like, AI is really cool, or like
Mm, mm,
crypto is really cool, or before it
yeah.
was kind of like hardware and like all this kind of stuff, right? 'Cause it's kind of like the latest hot trend, and I think those are like great things to follow and play around, whatever. Like I 100% think people should do it. But there's a point where you're like, should this be a startup? Should it be a company? And that's different. And so I think if you end up finding a really cool thing that you end up working on, there is one more step to be like, do I want to start a business? Is this a business? Do I want to start a startup from this? Uh, so I guess the bad reason to start a startup is like you've built something very cool.
Maybe I'll go a step further because I do think there's a lot of nuance here. Um, I think some people also start startups because of some trend, right? And so like I feel like there's a ton of people starting ChatGPT kind of like startups now. And I think they violate your law a little bit about like some problem or whatever. They're just like, ooh, ChatGPT's hot. Like, what random ChatGPT thing can we do? And they kind of start a startup around that. How do you feel about those types of kind of like startups or founders? Do you think it's okay? Do you think it's like a little weak?
Yeah, again, like I think the way I think about it is like
Mm.
great catalyst, right?
Mm.
Like great catalyst, really should have done
Mhm.
exactly what you're doing, but then you need the like you need the next step
Mm.
introspection to be like, okay, let's say now a year later this is not going to be hot. People don't care about AI. It's all of a sudden going to go to zero and it's going to be flat. Do I still really care about this kind of like thing that I'm building?
So I
Um,
haven't thought about it this way, but I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. I want to unpack it a little bit. There's this idea of the catalyst, which you've been talking about, which I think is interesting. Um, I think what you're saying is that the catalyst and the, what do you want to say? What do you want to call the long term thing?
we can just call
Okay.
it the long term thing.
There's like a catalyst and a long term thing. And I think what you're suggesting is they don't have to be the same thing. It's like perfectly okay if they're not. Sometimes it is, but it's kind of like sometimes it's not. Do you think you, for yourself personally, your catalyst and your long term thing were the same?
I don't think so. And I
I
don't
don't think
think
mine was either.
I might go even further, which is I think most
Yeah.
founders they're not. Like there's something that got you into startups in the first place because you were
Mm.
a little bit naive, which
That's
is like
us.
totally
It's
okay.
100%
And
us.
then you slowly start discovering kind of like, why am
Yeah.
I in this? Like over time. And you have to, I feel like the takeaway for me is you have to
Mm.
have both. Or else
Oh,
it kind
yeah.
of like doesn't sufficiently kind of like form this, I don't know, this like founder persona. And so yeah, maybe that's a blog post
Okay.
for later for us.
And maybe just to unpack the why you need both part. If you don't have the catalyst, you never get started. You just don't get in the game, right? So, like, obviously, you need the catalyst. If you don't have the long term thing, you don't stay in the game, right? You'll do 6 months kind of like as a founder, and then the catalyst will end, and then you're just kind of like out of it. And so, both parts are important. I think sometimes, which part do you think people think about the most? I feel like my thing is like people almost over worry about the catalyst and really they should be like thinking about the long term thing. But I don't know, or they don't make the
Yeah.
transition. Like it's easier to have
Just
a catalyst, they
yeah,
don't make the transition.
yeah. I think that's it. It's like people that don't make the transition is the ones who kind
Yeah.
of like fail. The reason I'm kind of like hesitating is like I actually don't think you should overthink
Yeah.
in the beginning, right? Like what's the so again, it's been a really long time since I've dated, but I'm gonna throw this out. You can correct me
And
if
by
I'm
really a
wrong,
long time
right?
you mean
It's
since
like
high school.
it's like
Yeah,
yeah,
it's the
very very
honeymoon
long time.
period. You're talking about the honeymoon
It's yeah, it's the dating
period.
analogy, right? There's kind of like the
Yeah,
initial like attraction, right? That's
yeah,
like why you're kind of like constantly
yeah,
talking this like partner, and then like over time you're kind of like okay, that kind of goes away, and you're kind of like
yeah.
okay, what's left? And you start building kind of like the real foundations of like a relationship, right? And so I feel
I'll
like
fill
similar
this in
kind of
for
thing
people
with
since
with
Brian
startups.
hasn't dated since he was in secondary school, and so actually has no idea what he's talking about. He's just reciting things he saw in movies. I feel like when you first start dating somebody, you're like, oh, they're attractive, and they like the same obscure music that I like, right? And you're like, oh my gosh, they must be the one. And then like 6 months in, it's like you realize like who cares if they like the same music? Like that means nothing. Like that doesn't matter at all, right? And so you have to kind of figure out why you should kind of stay together with this person. But the transition I think is kind of the important piece. Um, and I think why it's tricky for a lot of people is to make the transition you have to be kind of introspective, and being introspective and honest with yourself is like just kind of not that easy for human beings in general. And so I think that's kind of the piece here. Okay, maybe in the last kind of couple minutes to wrap up this episode, let's share kind of like key takeaways about how people should kind of like think about this larger point about you know why you should or should not start a startup. Any kind of last advice for people, Brian, on why they should or should not?
I don't know if I don't know if this is advice, but I mean I walked into this Brad Singer show not having a framework, but now I feel like I do, right? Which is which is like when you first get started,
Yeah,
don't overthink it. You're looking for this catalyst, and this catalyst happens because you just like naturally are gravitating toward a very hard problem. You're naturally gravitating towards something that's really fun or etc. Like you don't have to overthink it. It's kind of like you should do it if you feel like you should do it, and you should like jump in head first over some time period, right? Then you can start like thinking about it because you need the kind of like why am I staying?
Brian, what do you think your catalyst was?
I mean, for me, it was the
Okay.
impact, right? I kind of like just made a decision very early. I'm like, this is what I'm gonna do, and so I was like, let me keep my word.
I think
And
the
like
impact thing
do
is interesting for you though, because we worked on a lot of different problems. So it wasn't, I don't think it was just like, oh, impact is solving this one problem. It almost, I mean, just 'cause from conversations with you, the impact was almost like, oh, I can have a lot of impact if I start a company and like that kind of stuff. So there's like nuance here. I think some people drive impact from problem, but you actually were like, I can drive impact by like starting a company, and that's more than me as a single person can do. Is that right? I've never actually thought about that.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I also think that's weird. Like I haven't seen a lot of people who are kind of like, I made this commitment to like start a company, and so I'm gonna go do it, and I'm gonna kind of like looking
When
for problems. You don't think so? You had the kind of like,
I mean, no. I mean, a company was just like a vehicle so I could build
okay,
stuff. So I didn't really care about kind of starting a company.
yeah.
Um, where do you think, when did you make that promise to yourself? I don't feel like I've ever even heard about this.
I think it was like when I started college. Um,
Okay.
I don't know why,
O-
but
Okay. So that was the catalyst. So actually for you, do you feel like what was the thing, your long-term thing that's kept you in the game? I mean, we're like 15 years in here or something like that. What do you think has kept you in the game?
I mean, each individual company was the
Mhm.
problem, right? It's kind of like this problem is worth solving. Here's the vision for the company, etc. For each
Yep.
individual company, but then for kind of like the startup career, I think it's the uh, it's definitely kind of like impact, and then it's the like learning curve.
Got it.
It's just like I learned so
Do,
much
do you feel like there
all
was
the
a
time.
moment where you were like, I mean, now we just have words for it, but you went from this like catalyst mode to this like long term thing? Like, did you like sit down somewhere and have a conversation with yourself? You're like, all right, like,
I've had
okay,
many conversations of like, why am I doing this? And then you have to like answer that question over and over and over again. So it's those
okay.
times.
I think for me, and I think maybe sharing the catalyst and the long term thing I think is interesting for people, and I'll give kind of my takeaways as a result. I think there was many catalysts for me. I think, and Brian, you were there, so I'm curious, like if you felt this way when we were talking about it. I think one was I was working as a consultant, and that was just like not that fun. I just was like not having very much fun as a consultant, and so I think one catalyst was just like I didn't like my job, so I wanted a new job. I really like building stuff, and so I think that was kind of like another piece. And then this whole adventure thing just like seemed like fun. I think long term what's kept me in the game, and 'cause similar to Brian, I don't know if lots of people know this, but like I took a year off and just traveled by myself, and I was just like asking me this question of like, do I like this thing or not? And I think for me, the two things that kept me going was, I think the personal growth is just like I can't pass it up. It's like just too good. Like the steepness of the curve is just like great and fun, and I feel like it's still steep for me. I don't know if you feel like after so many years I feel like the curve is still steep. And then I think maybe the last part is the joy from kind of building stuff has never gone away. Like that's never weakened for me. And so I think the steepness and kind of the fun has been quite good for me. Maybe my one key takeaway for people who are listening to this is, if I was like looking at all the like good reasons to start stuff and all the bad reasons to start stuff, and the thing that jumped out at me is all the good reasons are kind of internally motivated. They're all things that are like, it's because you care or you think you're getting something out of thing, and all the bad reasons are externally motivated. It's like, I want to get money, or I want to get society to kind of pat me on the back and all of that stuff. So if I could, if I could people by the time they're getting to this are just like have listened to this whole podcast now, but if I could summarize the entire podcast, it's basically like, what are the good reasons to start a startup? If your reasons are internally motivated, you're in pretty good shape. If they're externally motivated, you should think a little bit harder about whether that's the case or not. And so I think that's my kind of key takeaway here. Let me shout out my startup hero. And by this, I mean, when Brian and I were first starting out, we had these like people that we like really liked and kind of like learned a lot from. Mine was Mark Andreessen. He wrote this post, we'll put it in the show notes and stuff, called Why Not to Do a Startup. And I feel like I read this post when I was quite young, and it was like quite formative to me. He like said all the reasons why not to do a startup, and I was like, for whatever reasons, I read all the reasons, and I was like, I finished it and was like more motivated to start a startup. which I don't know, just maybe just like makes me weird. But I just remember reading that post and having a kind of a big impact on me. I think that's it. We've covered a lot of stuff here. If you watch this far, thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like, and share. If you do, Brian will continue to do this show with me. I feel like every episode I have to like talk him into it. So please like and share and subscribe so our numbers look good and so we can get Brian on this. We'll be dropping a new episode soon. And as always, if you're a founder and you're working on something, apply to Iterative. We would love to kind of like help more founders. We'll put all the links in the description, but thanks for watching.